am Anne Choquette. I am CEO of TheLi.st. We are a community of high-impact women and non-binary leaders. We are devoted, underline devoted, to helping each other achieve and succeed. We are the amazing thing, the magic of the List community is that we are high impact leaders across industries, across different fields with amazing different backgrounds. And that makes us stronger together. And that gives us the opportunity to be able to celebrate so many of our members who have launched books into the world. Being a member of the List, you would kind of think that it's just one of those boxes that you tick off. We have a lot of thought leaders and authors here. So I'm thrilled to have you all here for this launch with the List with Allison Gilbert, who is the co-author with Dr. Ruth Westheimer of The Joy of Connections. I have a little bit of insight into how this book came together. Allison and I met each other about a year ago at TED Women and first talked a little bit about this book. And so I'm excited for you all to learn about how this book happened, learn about what it was like to write a book with an icon like Dr. Ruth, and most importantly, to learn about how we can deepen the connections, the meaningful connections that sustain us in our lives, in our personal lives, in our families. And as you all know, what's really important to me is how those connections help us rise in our careers. And so with that, I'm going to be quiet for one moment, catch my breath, check to see who needs to come in. And Allison, will you just introduce yourself and say hi to everybody?
I am so honored to be here. I have been looking forward to today's conversation since really Anne and I met. So thank you for spending your afternoon, just a portion of it with me. This has been the ride of the century, and I can't wait to share with you more how I got to meet Dr. Ruth and how the collaboration came to be and what it was like to lose my friend and now feel a huge responsibility to take her book over the finish line in her honor. So there's a difference in this book launch for me. This is my sixth book, and I haven't lost a co-author ever. And so I'm excited to share as much as I can about the process and the lessons I learned from this remarkable woman. So thank you, Anne.
Thank you. I think it is a strange experience to launch a book without your co-author but what I think when I think about Dr. Ruth, I think about what a tremendous life she lived and what a tremendous legacy, and even to have had this book as a final piece of her legacy, I think is so special. Will you talk about that beginning, that first piece where you first met Dr. Ruth, how this book came to be? Start at the beginning.
Yeah, before I launch into the beginning, let me just start with one little anecdote towards the end. So last week, the book came out and we did a launch event at the New York Public Library. And the love of Dr. Ruth is real. So let me just start there. It was, listen, I've done a lot of book events, but never have I done a book event that was in honor and in celebration with such an American icon, okay? Not only, of course, were her family and friends there, her son and her daughter, just her dearest friends, the public came out in droves. It was not only standing room only in the New York Public Library, they created a spillover room so folks could watch the live stream and yet still be in her orbit, so to speak. And so I wanted to kind of start at the end because the affection for her, there was no controversy, right? There was just adoration. And so it's within that feeling that I feel so lucky and I think it's coming out in the publicity that the book is getting, right? The publicity is not just for the book. And I know you talk about loneliness and the epidemic so much. So it's the issue, but it's her. So I just want to acknowledge um, that I'm missing my partner and I'm missing my friend. So back to the beginning. We only met last August, August of 2023,
Amazing.
when I got the best assignment of my life as a journalist to write an article for the New York Times about her quest, her desire to become New York State's first ambassador to loneliness. And so that was the first time we met, was in August. And then throughout the summer, she was charging forward to make sure that New York Governor Hochul appointed her. Now, this is remarkable.
Yeah.
I won't go too far down the path, but just so we can be clear, it is highly unusual, quite atypical, to go to the governor and raise your hand and say, look at me, appoint me. This is not how political appointments happen typically, but we all know that Dr. Ruth was not your usual human. She had chutzpah in spades. She knew she had a lot to say about loneliness, personally and professionally. And so, what the article finally said when it finally came out in November 2023 was that she got her dream job. She was appointed by the governor, the first such role in the entire country. And what a treat to get to meet her in the course of watching that journey unfold.
I love that. I'm reminded as you're rolling out the timeline. You and I met in October and the article hadn't come out yet. And I don't know if you even like dropped the like hint that you had done this article or this piece, but that I remember like, oh, I saw your name in the New York Times, like, oh, she wrote this article. It's amazing. Like I remember feeling that like that really special spark. Um, I was reading the intro of the book and I thought this was so special. I like circled this piece where she talks about loneliness and she says, if you've sunk into the swamp of loneliness, you may feel like it's impossible to get out. Take my hand and let me pull you out of the muck. Like that is such a special, not only did she know that she had something to say and the platform to say it, but that it's so personal, right? She's not standing on high, like offering like decrees on how to overcome loneliness in your life. She's like, take my hand. And then goes on to say, I've known loneliness, and talks about her own life work of creating connections. Will you talk a little bit about that, about in her own personal life, how she was lonely and overcame loneliness?
I think the magic of the joy of connections is that it's part biography light, right? It's not a biography, but there are so many revelations that she has chosen to share. When she's 96 years old, there's no reason to hold back anymore. And these stories are illustrative of a life that was hard, but also challenges met and overcome. So she was orphaned at 10 years old. She was sent by Kindertransport in Germany to Switzerland to escape the Nazis. And she never saw her parents and grandparents again, and she was a single child. So Dr. Ruth spent a lifetime piecing together new family, friend by friend by friend. She created a chosen family from scratch. And she was an accumulator. It wasn't like she had new friends and let other friends go. It was just more. I want more. I want my friends to know that to me, I'm going to invest so much in them that they are going to be my chosen family. And of course, she went on to have a family of her own making, but she never lost sight of the ability to like look in someone's eyes, make them feel warm and special and valued and valuable. And that was her secret sauce of accumulating relationships that propped her up and started slowly, not completely. You can't forever fill that gaping hole, but surely did it help. And I felt that I was in a master class of how to relationship build in the year, this intense year of friendship and collaboration that I got to spend with her. We were together every week, and it was a gift.
I love how you talk about her. I mean, I love you have a book to promote, right? Like we're out here talking about like what's in the book, but that you talk about your friend and your relationship and the depth of the experience that and the time you spent together. I just think that that's so special.
You know, I have to say, and I feel like I can share that with this group. There were so many parts of my brain that were on fire with her. So there was the professional brain that had a job to do when I first met her, right? I was a journalist, she was my subject, writing for the New York Times. There was that distance. And then the article came out, and then we were allowed to pivot a bit. And we wanted to stay in each other's lives. And to me, that's the best part about being a writer is that you get to follow where your nose goes or where your feelings are. And she had so much to say, which I know we're going to get into the specificity of her book and her lessons. But I was writing her lessons down as much for the reader as it was for me. I felt like I was learning from just the best in terms of how to forge and maintain these meaningful connections. It was, I don't know, how many of you, I'm curious by a raise of hands, like how many of us have our grandparents, our parents? I know for me, both of my parents died relatively young. My grandparents died as well. And so the wisdom in my life was less accessible. And I'm just wondering, do you guys mind sharing? I mean, do you have this type of wisdom readily available to you? This 96-year-old, 96 years of lessons learned, I think is kind of unique. I'm wondering, does anyone still have grandparents who are the, oh, you do. You're Elise, you're so, oh, I'm so happy for you. That's amazing.
Yeah,
Anyone
parents, not
else?
grandparents, sadly.
That's
But I
so,
think the lessons continue.
yeah. Yeah. So I love that. You are so lucky. So I just felt it's wonderful that we can lean on the hard lessons that she learned. So we don't maybe have to face the same friction in our lives. We can learn and then move forward, and not just in our personal lives. She was a working mother her entire life. So I love the fact that there's some career advice in here as well.
What did you adopt from her, from spending time with her in your own relationship building?
Well, it's really interesting. I wrote an essay also for the New York Times after she died. There's a very specific lesson that I learned from her. And I turned 54 this year. And what Dr. Ruth kept explaining to me over and over and over again when we were researching and writing The Joy of Connections is to make sure you tell your friends, make sure they know how much they mean to you. So for my birthday, again, other thing about Dr. Ruth that you have to know, She doesn't wait. She is super impatient. And so don't wait for the phone to ring to make your birthday plans. Make your plans for yourself. So I took both of those pieces of advice. I called a small group of dear friends, elementary school, high school, college. I invited them to my home before they had any chance to invite me for a drink, or maybe the drink invitation would never come, or coffee, or birthdays. Maybe everyone was too busy. And I made my birthday celebration a way to honor them. And that is so Dr. Ruth. And I learned that from her, just to make sure that you're telling your friends, you're magnifying what the relationship means to you. And by doing that, you're deepening that connection because they then know you're telling them that they are so important to you. And so that's a direct lesson that I put into action while we were writing the book together.
Deepening is such a good word. I love that, right? It's like we can have a million surface connections, people that you can say hi to, like people that you're like, you see, but like to really invest in making those relationships deeper. You can't do that with everyone. One of the things that I loved, that I heard you say, or maybe read, I can't remember. I'm like swimming in Allison Gilbert and Dr. Ruth, was that when you left her, she would say, "When will I see you again?"
Oh, the
And
best.
it was like even before the meeting is over, you're on her calendar again for the next time that you see each
Yeah.
other.
I want to just strip that apart just a little bit. So before I could even leave, she would say, "When will I see you again?" And let me just kind of unpack that and why it's so magical. One, she's being proactive, right? Again and again, you will see that in Dr. Ruth's life, she is not sitting on her back foot. She is doing what she needs to do to get what she wants, right? What she wants is another date on the calendar. So she's being proactive. Number two, by her asking me that question, "When will I see you again?" it made me feel special. And so by asking someone that question, you're making them feel special. And that just comes full circle because then they want to see you again, because then you've actually told them that this is a relationship worth pursuing.
Yeah.
And the third thing I will say, and this comes up again and again in the book, there are 5 sections in the book. Dr. Ruth's menu for connection, right? There's 5 components. The biggest one may surprise you. It's self. It seems rather odd to say that in a book about relationships that the biggest section should be about look in the mirror. Take stock of how you behave and what you say that might be inadvertently making relationship building with you harder than you expect. And so the question that you just said, Anne, when will I see you again? It shows interest, which creates warmth, which made people want to spend time with Dr. Ruth. So there's 5 components. There's self, there's community, there's friends and lovers, because of course it's a Dr. Ruth book, so lovers had to be in there. There's family, and one of my favorite sections, because I think it's so surprising that someone who is 95 and 96 years old would include it, is technology.
Yeah.
She would be the last person to say, which I love, and we can go into this, technology can, in fact, as we know, really help with our connections. But it's how we use it is the focus of the technology section.
I flagged before we move on to technology, but I flagged this page in the self section, which I thought was so interesting about learn the Westheimer maneuver, which you think is one thing, and yet, although there was also the master the art of masturbation. I was like, oh, well, that caught my eye. What are we talking about here in yourself? And I did love actually how she makes the connection between the love that you have and the sex and love that you have and the relationships and the lovers. I actually think that that's quite nice, and also talks about the difference between feeling being alone, right? The beauty, you talk about she writes about the beauty of solitude, versus the hunger of loneliness, right? The lack, the scarcity feeling. But this idea of the Westheimer maneuver, and I think it's so interesting, this idea of sign up for a class, right? You have to see each other in person. Will you talk about that a little bit, about the difference between the ways we're digitally connected and seeing each other in person? This Zoom would be gorgeous if we were all in the same room together. However, it facilitates everybody, instead of taking multiple hours out of their day to have a lunchtime session, like all we had to do was walk from one room to the other in most cases, or one part of the office, or whatever, however that works out. Will you talk a little bit about that, about how technology brings us together and keeps us apart?
Yeah, so in the menu for connection, technology is one component. One side of the coin is that if you go in the opposite direction and don't use technology, if for some reason you make that the enemy, and you're off all apps and you're not using your phone and you kind of disengage from group chats and you don't belong to any sort of online community, you actually may be doing what you actually don't want, which is disengaging and further isolating yourself in a world that does revolve so much around technology. The secret, from Dr. Ruth's point of view, is to use technology to fuel, whenever possible, in-person connections. So the danger becomes like when we scroll and when we maybe use that time to avoid going to events where we don't want to get dressed and go outside, when it's maybe easier to binge our favorite Netflix series. If we're doing that in lieu of meeting people in person and engaging face to face, if that becomes a pattern, and then we're losing the opportunity by extension to build these connections, that's the danger zone. So back to that self component, evaluate how you are actually interacting with your media. And when you do your ledger, when you look at your balance sheet, if it's precluding you from engagement, then you know you have something to pay attention to.
Yeah.
And I love that. So it's a recipe to keep in mind when you're looking at the scales. And I think it's really important. When you're talking about an older population, she would argue that if you're not online, then you're actually not engaging with your children and perhaps your grandchildren, perhaps knowing about the food festival coming to town. Because when was the last time a flyer came in the mail? So she's the last person to villainize digital media,
Yeah.
which I think is healthy to hear from and hear about, I think.
I mean, I do think we spend a lot of time engaging with our technology, but I also think that the magic of Zoom, right? The importance that the way we've changed the habits around our digital technology, especially like we learned during the pandemic, right? That this was our lifeline when we couldn't actually see each other. And I think particularly, I don't know, like we're all so busy. I think the busyness, and to be able to keep keep those relationships warm. I mean, you know that we work on this idea of like 10 minutes to togetherness, and that every day you should spend 10 minutes intentionally deepening those relationships. And sometimes, actually most of the time, that's not in person. That's walking around the office, or like sending a text, or sending a LinkedIn message, or letting people know that it's just like keeping, because we are so time starved, right? It's like keeping those relationships warm until you can see each other again.
Well, let me just address that directly. So, number one, I love your work so much, as you know. Anne's work is quoted, in The Joy of Connections. We've linked to your report in the resources section in the back of the book. So I praise and laud what you have brought to the conversation. And I will add, it's not a but, I will add that Dr. Ruth has a wonderful term about meaningful busyness.
Yes.
This is so important for all of us who are juggling a million things to keep in mind. So, what Dr. Ruth would say about meaningful busyness as opposed to just busyness, we can all join 1,000 organizations. We could be a volunteer here and be a mother there and run a company here and maybe want to, donate our time because we feel compelled to do so across many different organizations. She would say something like this: every time you can, choose depth over breadth. More so, I'll double down on that even further. Where meaningful connections come from is that, for example, if you volunteer at too many places, the chances of you running into the same people over and over again will decrease. But if you volunteer, as an example, every Wednesday night at 7 at the local food bank, you're going to see the same people with consistency. And with consistency comes an opportunity to strengthen our bonds.
Mm.
So I love that meaningful busyness. So it's a matter of being really judicious with where you put your time. And she would say the time spent on nurturing these connections, as I'm sure you would say too, Anne, so valuable to not only our careers, but to our longevity. We will live longer, the Surgeon General says, by investing in relationships. And I know you know these stats, but for everyone joining us, loneliness is not only a feeling that hurts, it becomes a physical challenge across many fronts. It leads to dementia, anxiety, heart disease, and it could decrease your life expectancy as much as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day.
I mean,
So it's really important
yeah.
for how long we live that we are seriously taking this epidemic.
I'm very grateful to Dr. Murthy for um, shining a light on the loneliness epidemic. And it really was, for me, it was quite a light bulb to even think about um, the ways in which from my personal life, where did I feel unsupported? Where did I feel unseen? Where did I feel disconnected or isolated? And to even be able to give words to this idea of loneliness. Um, and you write, uh, Dr. Ruth writes in the book, or you write together in the book um, about how hard it is to even admit, right, that you are feeling lonely. We think that there's something wrong with us, that like people don't like us. They think, yeah, and
Isn't
that's
that
just
what
not the
Dr.
case.
Ruth has always done, right? So if you look back into the 1980s, when the taboo then was a different epidemic, right? You had the AIDS epidemic. And what she did so beautifully back when she rose to fame was shatter those taboos and to make those who were feeling othered, those in the gay homosexual community who felt that they were being victimized by others who were now fearful of them or blaming them. I mean, you could see the parallels between the loneliness epidemic that we are in now.
Yeah.
Shame connects them both. And shame is what she wanted at the end of the day to help everyone overcome. We hit a little bit on her past, but if you go back to World War II Germany,
Yeah.
when she was 10 years old and sent away by a train, the othered and being othered, so much so that your family was murdered. She was all about trying to make sure people, human beings, have a sense of belonging. And so I feel that the line, the thread, the needle that that we can really highlight between her work about sex and sexual dysfunction, and now this pivot to loneliness. It's really not as large of a sea change as maybe it seems. Because at the bottom line, you can't have good sex, she would say, if you don't have a satisfying and fulfilling relationship. And so I think relationships at the end of the day and feeling a sense of belonging was at the root of who Ruth was. And I find that both heartening and instructive.
Yeah. I want to talk a little more about that feeling of belonging and also how that led to her success and what can we learn from her because we are a professional community. What can we learn from her about our business?
Yes.
While I'm asking that question, I'm gonna, after this question, turn it over to Q&A from
Oh,
everybody.
good,
And so
good, good, good.
you can put put your questions in the chat. I wanted to encourage people to do that. So I do think that it is so interesting that she became a success, right? Like she was a huge success. She was not just a therapist. She
And
was
she
a
loved
therapist
being
with
successful,
platform.
by the way. The woman was 4'7" and had the ego. She loved being successful. She loved having a platform. She was unapologetic about being Dr. Ruth. She loved being Dr. Ruth. So I'm just saying,
Yeah,
we
so
should
talk
love
a
our
little bit
brand.
about, we'll talk about that, talk about like what is the connection between the relationship she built and the success. You hinted at it that she wanted what she wanted, right? She
Oh,
had
yeah.
this ambition and she was going to ask for it. She wants you to be on her calendar again. She wanted, and maybe it was she wanted a radio show, she wanted whatever, the books. Tell us about how some of this turned into her secrets for success.
I'll give you one story that I think summarizes a part of this. So, this book came together, as we've talked about, really fast. As most of you know, books take oftentimes, most of the time, years to come together. We didn't sign, so the article came out in November of 2023. Then the idea for this book started bubbling up. We didn't sign the contract to write it until January 2024. And voila, the book is out September 3rd. This is not normal. Okay, so this was really hard to pull together that quickly. And I don't think the quality suffered one bit.
It's really
This structure,
beautiful.
it's
It's so,
really,
it's beautiful. It's
thank
like
you.
digestible. It's like, it's accessible. I really think it's special.
Thank you. Yeah, I do too, but I'm biased, but I love it. And my point in saying this, so we were exhausted at the end of this. Well, I wouldn't say we. I'm excluding Dr. Ruth from this characterization. My other co-author, Pierre, and I were exhausted. This was a really fast process. And at the end, when we were kind of patting ourselves on the back, job well done. Do you know what Dr. Ruth said? What's next?
It's amazing.
Her her worldview was about moving forward. It was about action, and it wasn't about resting on your laurels. It was about continuing to make a difference and using the time that we have to be a bulldozer and to make sure what you want to accomplish is done. She was also famously impatient. And so she might ask you 1,000 times when something may be done. And that becomes hard to hear after a while. When is this going to be done? When is that chapter? And it's because she is just wanting to produce. And while that may sound superficially, perhaps exhausting, it's actually, I think, the secret to living a long life. Now that I've seen it in action, it's about always having forward motion. And I love that. And the other lesson I will really take to heart that I think is important to this group, she was a working mom her whole life. And she would say, don't only prioritize financial wealth. And again, she'd be the first to admit, perhaps, that she comes from a place now, writing this book at 95 and 96, where she hasn't had to worry about finances for some time. But she would say, do not forget to prioritize your mental wealth.
Yeah.
And here's what she meant by that very briefly. Before you take that new job that's 3,000 miles away, because it has a great new title and perhaps a higher salary, just make sure you put on the pros and cons list some unobvious things. Who will you call to water your plants when you go on vacation? What happens if you twist your leg and you can't go to the grocery store and you find yourself in a new town? Who are you going to rely upon? If you have aging parents and you're 3,000 miles away, what friction will that cause in your life going forward? So she would just say, on your ledger, don't discount mental wealth. Don't only prioritize financial wealth.
Did she have those people around her who would water her plants? She kept she kept those, like those long term, I guess I mean, right? The long term relationships. I love that she talks about her husband. She was married for 35 years and still he was her third husband. I think that that's pretty interesting. But were a lot of her relationships lifelong relationships?
Lifelong. In fact, I am in touch with her first boyfriend that she ever had back when she was raised in an orphanage in Switzerland. She collected friends like precious gems, and she wouldn't let them go. I don't know if you guys have ever been, I hope you haven't, this is sad, but to a funeral of someone who's of a certain age. I have been. And in my experience, those funerals are really small because the most of their contemporaries are no longer living or they've let friendships go. I went to her funeral. I went to her Shiva. Let me tell you, packed, and not because of celebrity, because of who she was as a friend, across generations. And that's one thing I'll say before we cut to questions. She would say, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of age, look to friends who aren't just like you. Because that's a deepening way of going through life. It's a richer way of going through life. And she had so many friends who were nowhere near her in age, but yet fueled her, and I think kept her young.
I love that. I love that. I just love to see you tell these stories and the warmth that you have for her. Kathy Sandler asked about the audiobook. You did you do part of the audiobook? Did she do who's the voice? I'm sorry, I don't know that. Who's the voice in the
Yeah, so thank you so much. So Tova is this incredible actor. If you go online, you could see Tova's socials. She is hugely popular, and she played Dr. Ruth in performances on stage. So she knows intimately the Dr. Ruth persona and the voice. And so we were thrilled when she said yes to recording the audiobook, because not only did she know her in a professional sense and played Ruth professionally, but they also had an enduring friendship. I and Pierre, the other co-author, we were very honored. We were reading our acknowledgments and we read the dedications. And so we were happy to be a part of it too. But Tova knocked it out of the park.
That's great. How cool is that?
So cool.
Yeah,
So cool. And they were really, really good friends. You know, I went to Ruth's 96th birthday party. It was for family and friends. That was on June 4th. That was her 96th birthday, and she died in July. And Tova was there. So it was a love fest for her 96th birthday. It was great.
I love that she was a Gemini. I get that. I am a Gemini too. We always like to drop a little in there.
Kathy, thank you for that question. That's such a great question.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I just want to remind everyone, as I always do, that we have, I'm going to pop it into the chat again. Please buy the book. I actually, I left copies with my mother and my sister because I wanted everybody in our, like, I wanted our family to all read this book together.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and I know that my mother will like find it so like heartwarming and creating connections. And so
I
thank
think
you
that's
for
what's
that.
so special about your work too, Anne. And like the 10 minutes to togetherness, of course, amplifies building connections in a work setting. And of course, Dr. Ruth talks about career in the joy of connections. But no matter where you are, we are all human. So we have family connections, we have sexual relationships, we have platonic friendships, we have community, we have neighbors. What you won't get in this book, just to kind of make sure that we're framing this completely appropriately, while the Surgeon General is a part of this book, there's a big Q&A at the end where they engage in conversation. This is not that kind of dry government perspective. And sure, there's a lot being done at the federal level, the state level, the community level, and all that is super important. But Dr. Ruth was a behavioral therapist. She wanted quick results. She'd be the first one to say, if you came to see her as a client and you had a sexual problem, she wouldn't like go interrogate your childhood. She wouldn't care. She wants to know, what is your sex problem? Let's solve it so you can go have good sex. And that's the same approach with this book. It's like, okay, you're lonely. Maybe you're an empty nester. And you're like, you really want to have this new phase of your life and you want to fill it with more friendship. Okay, that's the problem. Let's solve for X, right? And I just love, it's so Dr. Ruth. It's straightforward, it's to the point, no euphemisms. And I would say, and I wonder if you would agree, a healthy dose of tough love.
I think so. You know what I was so um struck by in what you're just saying now is that there are a lot of factors in loneliness, right? You talk about the Surgeon General. I've got his book, Dr. Ruth and Vivek Murthy is right here too. These are my stack of like togetherness books. Um, but there are a lot of pieces, right? And there's a lot of solutions. There's a policy solution and a legal solution to funding. And there's in your business and in your community. And there's a lot of people who are putting a lot of interest around loneliness because it is a huge problem and we have to all do our part to chip away at it, right? From where you are sitting, you need to do your part. And I think that that actually is what Dr. Ruth recognized when she called Kathy Hochul and said, yo, Kathy, put me, tap me in, coach, right? That she could do her part of solving it now, of giving people actionable tools. First of all, like even the framework of thinking through yourself, yourself, your family, your friends and lovers, your community, the technology, a calendar, right? Like to break it down and make it simple and actionable. And like you said, impatience is in this case a tremendous virtue. I'm so grateful that she didn't wait any longer because we might not have had the book and we might
Yeah.
not have had this wisdom to share. Um,
Can I
I
share something with you that I learned at the New York Public Library event? Her son and daughter spoke, and they're PhDs in their own right. And at the end, when this book was in galley form, and Dr. Ruth was having some more bad days than good days, they would read her The Galley. And I'm just sharing that with you because she was so invested in what she had to say that hearing her own words and knowing that she was still going to be making an impact, that she was still going to be a teacher, that she was still going to be a helper, they said at the New York Public Library was very meaningful to her and gave her hope and vibrancy. And I will never forget that.
I love that. I love the meaning and the depth and the love that you put into this book. And it is so clear to hear you talk about it, how important this book is. And so I'm so grateful that we could play a small part in helping this find its audience. Everybody, please buy copies, send them to your mother, your daughter, your sister, your brother, send them, give them at work. It is actionable, it is accessible, it is warm, it is frank, as you said, it is a little bit of tough love. Um,
Can I
so
tell you a funny story, Anne, just before we
yes,
go back to questions? So they asked Dr. Ruth to record, I think, Kathy, you will especially appreciate this. So they asked Dr. Ruth to record a video for the sales team, right? So before the book was even in galley form, they want to get the sales team like really hyped, right, to go sell the book. So Dr. Ruth obliged, and she was still really great on camera, and she recorded it. And this is the best message. She's like, if you sell this book, I promise you, you will have the best sex for the rest of your life. So that's what I will say. If you buy this book, Dr. Ruth will say you'll have great sex for the rest of your life.
that's amazing. Amen to that. I'm going to leave you with this one question to wrap us up. What the Dr. Ruth question, what is next?
Well, my commitment to her is that I will do everything I can to continue sharing her message of why connections are so important and why we all can't be left off the hook. We are all responsible for ourselves. And loneliness is, in fact, curable. But we have to look to ourselves to take the first step and then the second step. And the book is basically 100 baby steps. And so that's what's next for me. My next step is one day, the next day, doing whatever interviews I can to amplify. So if I were to ask on Dr. Ruth's behalf, please share so her last message can endure and grow. And together we can help as many people as we can, because we all deserve feeling good and feeling full. So yeah, that's what's next for me.
All right. I'm on your team. I'm on Dr. Ruth's team. I am part of this mission. Thank you for sharing so vulnerably here today. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you for helping to spread the togetherness. I
Thank you so
appreciate you all.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you
Bye.
so much.